The cold barrel of Richard Fellow's gun pressed against Rose Fellow's temple as the deed to their homestead hung limp between his fingers. His hands had once held hers with tenderness, but now they only brought terror as he forced her to sign away the 160 acres of South Dakota land they'd worked for 3 years. "Sign it, Rose." Richard's voice dripped with whiskey and malice. "I'm heading to the gold fields, and I don't need a wife or this worthless dirt anymore." It was April 1878, and the Dakota Territory spring had barely thawed the ground beneath their modest cabin outside Yankton. Rose's fingers trembled as she scratched her name onto the paper, tears blurring the ink. At 24, she'd believed the promises Richard had made when they married 5 years ago, promises now as barren as the fields he'd neglected while drinking away their savings. "There," she whispered. "It's done." Richard snatched the paper, folded it crudely, and tucked it into his coat. He grabbed the rucksack he'd packed with their remaining food and the cash from selling their last milk cow. Without another word, he stumbled out the door and mounted their only horse. Rose watched from the doorway as her husband, the man who'd vowed to cherish her, disappeared down the trail toward Yankton, leaving her with nothing but an empty pantry and a broken heart. For 3 days, Rose rationed the few potatoes and half-jar of preserves remaining in the cabin. On the 4th morning, she awoke to the reality that she had nothing left. No food, no livestock, no seed for planting. The land she'd worked alongside Richard belonged to the bank now, and soon they would come to claim it. Rose donned her threadbare coat and began the long walk toward town, her stomach gnawing with hunger, her mind swirling with desperate options. Perhaps Mrs. Holloway at the general store would extend credit, or maybe the church would offer some charity. 5 miles into her journey, dark clouds gathered, and a spring storm unleashed its fury. Rain pelted Rose's face as she trudged forward, her boots sinking into the muddy road. The sudden crack of thunder spooked a herd of cattle being driven along the main trail ahead. The startled beasts scattered, some charging directly toward her. Rose scrambled toward a large boulder, but her foot caught in the mud, twisting painfully as she fell. "Head him off, Jasper," a deep voice called out over the thunder and bellowing cattle. Rose looked up through rain-soaked hair to see a cowboy on horseback skillfully turn the cattle away from her. Another rider circled back, bringing his horse to a stop beside where she lay in the mud. "Madam, are you hurt?" The cowboy dismounted in one fluid motion, kneeling beside her. His face was partially hidden beneath the brim of his hat, but his eyes showed genuine concern. "My ankle," Rose managed, trying to stand but faltering. The cowboy steadied her with strong hands. "I'm Mason Montgomery, riding for the Triple M Ranch. Let me help you." "Rose Fellows," she replied, grimacing as she tested her weight on the injured ankle. "I was walking to Yankton. In this storm. That's still 7 miles ahead." Mason frowned, looking at the darkening sky. "Our camp is just over that ridge. Let's get you dry and see to that ankle." Before Rose could protest, Mason lifted her onto his horse and mounted behind her. The warmth of his chest against her back was the first comfort she'd felt in days. At the camp, 2 other cowboys had already erected a canvas shelter and stoked a fire that fought valiantly against the rain. Mason introduced them as Jasper and Tom before helping Rose to a seat near the fire. While the others tended the settled cattle, Mason wrapped her ankle with practiced hands. "This should help with the swelling, but you need to stay off it," he said, reaching for a tin pot hanging over the fire. "Coffee's hot and supper will be ready soon." Rose stared at the steaming cup he offered. "I can't pay you." Mason's weathered face softened. "Madam, out here we don't let folks go hungry. Payment's not needed." The simplicity of his kindness broke something inside Rose. Tears welled in her eyes as Mason ladled a bowl of fragrant stew and handed it to her, along with a chunk of fresh bread. "Eat," he said gently. "Then you can tell me what brings a lady like you out alone in this weather." Rose ate slowly, savoring each bite of the hearty stew venison, potatoes, and wild onions in a rich broth. As she ate, the story spilled out. Her marriage to Richard, his growing drinking problem, the failed crops, and finally, his betrayal 4 days ago. "He forced me to sign the deed over to him so he could sell it to the bank," she concluded, staring into the fire. "Said he was headed to the Black Hills to find gold." Mason's jaw tightened. "No man worthy of the name treats his wife that way." "He left me with nothing," Rose said, her voice barely audible above the rain pattering on the canvas. "I don't know what I'll do." Mason refilled her coffee cup. "First thing is to get you to town tomorrow when the storm passes. I know the sheriff there, Hank Willis. Good man. He might have something to say about your husband's methods." That night, wrapped in Mason's spare bedroll, Rose slept better than she had in months. The cowboys took turns keeping watch over the cattle, but she noticed Mason's bedroll remained conspicuously close to hers, as if he'd appointed himself her personal guardian. Morning broke clear and bright. Rose's ankle felt better, though Mason insisted she ride his horse while he walked alongside. As they approached Yankton, Rose felt a mixture of dread and uncertainty. The town's buildings rose before them, the general store, the saloon, the bank that now owned her home. Sheriff Willis listened gravely to Rose's story, his gray mustache twitching with indignation. "I'll look into this, Mrs. Fellows. Putting a gun to someone's head for a signature isn't legal, even out here." "Thank you, Sheriff," Mason said. "But what about Mrs. Fellows' situation now?" "She needs somewhere to stay, work maybe." The sheriff scratched his chin. "Mrs. Caldwell at the boarding house might need help. Her arthritis has been acting up something fierce." Rose found herself installed at the modest boarding house by midday. Mrs. Caldwell, a widow in her 60s with kind eyes and gnarled hands, offered room and board in exchange for cooking and cleaning help. Mason promised to check on her before he and the other cowboys moved their herd north. 3 days later, as Rose was hanging laundry in the boarding house yard, Mason appeared, hat in hand. "We're moving out tomorrow," he said, shifting his weight from one boot to the other. "I wanted to make sure you were settling in all right." Rose smiled, genuinely pleased to see him. "Mrs. Caldwell is very kind and the work isn't difficult. The sheriff sent a telegram but hasn't heard anything about Richard yet." Mason nodded, then reached into his saddlebag. "I brought you something." He extended a small burlap sack. "Seeds, tomatoes, beans, carrots, Mrs. Caldwell mentioned there's a garden plot out back that no one tends anymore." Rose accepted the gift, touched by his thoughtfulness. "Thank you. I've missed having earth between my fingers. I also." Mason hesitated, then continued, "I rode out to your homestead. The bank hasn't posted notices yet. There's still time if you wanted to challenge your husband's claim, seeing as how the signature was coerced." Hope flickered briefly in Rose's heart before reality doused it. "Even if I could get the land back, I can't work it alone. I have no money for seed or animals." Mason looked at her intently. "My drive finishes in 6 weeks. I'll be coming back through Yankton. Maybe by then we can figure something out." After Mason left, Rose planted the garden with Mrs. Caldwell's blessing. Each seed she pressed into the soil felt like a small act of defiance against the helplessness Richard had left her with. The work at the boarding house was steady, and Mrs. Caldwell proved to be not only an employer but a friend, teaching Rose to make her famous apple pies and sharing stories of her own younger days as a pioneer wife. 2 weeks after Mason's departure, Sheriff Willis summoned Rose to his office. "Got word about your husband," he said gravely. "Richard was caught cheating at cards in Deadwood. There was a fight. He didn't survive it." Rose sat stunned, a confusing mixture of emotions washing over her. Relief, anger, grief for the good man Richard had once been before whiskey changed him. "There's more," the sheriff continued. "The money and deed were still on him. The deed's being returned to you as his widow, though the money was mostly gone." Just like that, Rose was a widow with land but no means to work it. The sheriff advised her to sell the property to the bank anyway it would fetch enough to give her a fresh start somewhere else. Rose thanked him but made no decisions. Each night, she fell asleep thinking of 160 acres sitting empty, and of a cowboy with kind eyes who'd fed her when she was hungry. As promised, 6 weeks later, Mason returned to Yankton. Rose spotted him from the boarding house window, his tall figure unmistakable even at a distance. She smoothed her dress, one of Mrs. Caldwell's she'd altered, and pinched her cheeks for color before going out to greet him. "Mrs. Fellows," Mason tipped his hat, a smile breaking across his tanned face. "You're looking well." "As are you, Mr. Montgomery." Rose couldn't help returning his smile. "Would you join me for coffee? The garden you helped start is producing nicely. We could sit in the shade there." Over coffee and fresh-baked biscuits, Rose told Mason about Richard's fate and her reclaimed deed. Mason listened intently, his blue eyes studying her face. "Have you decided what to do with the land?" he asked. Rose sighed. "The sensible thing would be to sell it, but every time I consider it, something stops me. That land was supposed to be our future. Selling it feels like admitting defeat." Mason set his coffee cup down carefully. "I've been thinking about your situation these past weeks. I've saved most of my earnings these past few years, hoping to start my own ranch someday." He paused, seeming to gather courage. "What would you think about a partnership? Your land, my savings and know-how. We could make something of that place together." Rose's heart quickened. "A partnership, to start," Mason said, meeting her eyes directly. "I won't pretend I haven't thought of more, but I respect you too much to presume." Rose studied the man before her, his honest face, the calloused hands that had helped her without question, the eyes that looked at her with respect rather than ownership. "I think," she said slowly, "that would be a fine beginning." By early August, Rose and Mason had transformed the neglected homestead. With his savings, they purchased 2 milk cows, a dozen chickens, and a sturdy plow horse. Mason repaired the cabin's leaking roof and broken porch while Rose planted a late garden and cleaned years of grime from the windows. They worked side by side from sunrise to sunset, their partnership growing into something deeper with each passing day. Mason never presumed, always asking before making decisions that affected them both. He slept in the small lean-to he'd built behind the cabin, respecting Rose's position as a recent widow. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the prairie gold, Rose found herself studying Mason's profile. "Why did you help me that day on the road?" she asked suddenly. Mason turned to her, surprise crossing his features. "You needed help. Many would have ridden past. Or worse." Mason was quiet for a moment. "My mother was left alone when my father died in the war. We had a small farm in Missouri. A neighbor helped us through that first hard winter, shared what little they had. I was only 10, but I never forgot that kindness." He looked out at the fields they'd worked together. "I believe people should help each other. That's how we all survive out here." Rose reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "You've given me more than survival, Mason. You've given me hope." Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question asked and answered in the golden light of dusk. As September brought the first harvest from their shared labor, Mason asked Rose to marry him properly. They stood among rows of ripening corn, the evidence of their successful partnership stretching around them. "I know it hasn't been long," Mason said, his usual confidence faltering slightly. "And I understand if you need more time after everything with Richard. But I love you, Rose. I think I started falling for you that first day when you accepted my help with grace, despite everything you'd been through." Rose touched his face, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath her fingers. "You showed me what a true partnership could be built on respect and shared dreams rather than fear and control. I would be honored to be your wife." They married in October with the entire town of Yankton in attendance. Mrs. Caldwell baked the wedding cake, and Sheriff Willis gave the bride away. The Triple M Ranch Cowboys rode in for the celebration, bringing a fine Hereford bull as a wedding gift, the start of what would become the Montgomery breeding stock. Their first winter as husband and wife tested their resolve. Blizzards isolated the homestead for weeks at a time, and supplies ran low before February's thaw allowed travel to town. But unlike the fearful isolation Rose had known with Richard, these months with Mason were filled with warmth, planning for spring planting, and the deep comfort of genuine companionship. By their first anniversary, Rose was expecting their first child. Mason built a proper crib from oak and expanded the cabin to include a nursery. Their herd had grown to include 20 cattle and a reputation for quality that spread throughout the territory. On a warm May evening in 1880, Rose gave birth to their son, whom they named Samuel after Mason's father. Mason held the baby with tender wonder, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. "Thank you," he whispered to Rose, kissing her damp forehead, "for our son, for believing in our partnership, for making this land into a home." Rose smiled tiredly. "We did it together. That's what makes it different." As Samuel grew, so did their ranch. By 1883, they'd purchased adjoining land from neighbors moving west, tripling their original 160 acres. Rose managed the household accounts with shrewd precision while Mason handled the livestock breeding program. Together, they made decisions that slowly transformed their homestead into one of the most prosperous small ranches in the territory. Their daughter Emily arrived in 1884 with her father's blue eyes and her mother's determination. Mason doted on both children, teaching Samuel to ride almost as soon as he could walk and carrying Emily on his shoulders as he checked fence lines and cattle. One winter evening when the children were asleep, Rose found Mason at the kitchen table with papers spread before him, plans for a larger house to accommodate their growing family. "You ever regret it?" Rose asked softly, setting a cup of coffee beside him. "Taking on a hungry widow and her barren land," Mason looked up, his face softening. "The only regret I have is that I didn't find you sooner." He pulled her onto his lap, his arms encircling her waist. "Remember when I told you about the neighbor who helped my mother? That neighbor eventually became my stepfather. He taught me that sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as someone else's hardship." He kissed her gently. "You were never a burden, Rose. You were always a blessing." In 1888, 10 years after Mason had first found Rose injured on the muddy road to Yankton, their ranch hosted a celebration. Friends from miles around gathered to mark the completion of their new 2-story house and the official naming of the Montgomery Ranch with its distinctive brand recognized throughout the Dakota Territory. As guests marveled at their accomplishments, Sheriff Willis, now retired, but still possessing his impressive mustache, raised a toast. "To Mason and Rose Montgomery, who proved that with hard work, determination, and love, the prairie provides not just sustenance but prosperity." Later that night, After the guests had departed and the children were tucked into their new bedrooms, Mason and Rose stood on the porch of their new home, looking out at the land that had almost been lost. "I've been thinking," Mason said, his arm around Rose's shoulders, "about starting a program for widows and families who have fallen on hard times, teaching them ranching skills, maybe helping them get established on their own land." Rose leaned into his embrace. "I think that's a wonderful idea. It would mean sharing some of what we've built," Mason cautioned. "As you once shared your bread and hope with me," Rose reminded him. "Some debts can only be repaid by passing the kindness forward." Mason turned her to face him, his expression serious. "You know, I never told you everything about that day we met. The truth is, I was at a crossroads myself. The Triple M was offering me a permanent position as foreman, good money and security. But I kept feeling there was something more waiting for me." His hands tightened gently on her shoulders. "When I saw you on that road so determined, despite everything, something inside me recognized that you were my future." Rose reached up to touch his face, still handsome despite the lines time had etched around his eyes. "So, we saved each other." "That's what true partnerships do," Mason said, drawing her close. In the years that followed, the Montgomery Ranch became known not just for its cattle but for its generosity. Families down on their luck found work, training, and often a small parcel of land to start again. Children orphaned by the harsh realities of frontier life found a home with Mason and Rose until permanent arrangements could be made. Their own children grew strong and capable, learning both ranching skills and the value of compassion. By 1898, 20 years after their beginning, Mason and Rose had built more than a successful ranch. They'd created a legacy of kindness that rippled throughout the community, that had grown around them as South Dakota achieved statehood, and the frontier gradually transformed into established farmland and towns. One spring evening, much like the one when Mason had first proposed their partnership, they sat together on the porch swing of their home. At 44, Rose's hair showed streaks of silver, and at 48, Mason's shoulders carried the evidence of years of physical labor. But their hands remained intertwined, their dreams still shared. "You remember what you said to me that first night by the campfire?" Rose asked. "When I told you Richard had left me with nothing," Mason smiled. "I probably said something about him not being worthy of the name man." "You did," Rose laughed softly. "But you also fed me when I was hungry, not just with food but with hope." She rested her head against his shoulder. "I never imagined then that we would build all this." "I did," Mason admitted. "Not the details, perhaps. But I knew from that first day that whatever future I had, I wanted to share it with you." As the prairie sunset painted the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Rose thought about the desperate young widow she had been and the fulfilled woman she had become. The land that her first husband had taken from her had flourished under the care of her true partner. The hunger she had known for food, for security, for love had been satisfied 100 times over. "Thank you," she whispered to Mason, "for the bread and the hope." Mason kissed her gently, the familiar gesture still sending warmth through her after all these years. "Thank you for turning them into a feast we could share." Together, they watched the stars emerge above the land that had witnessed their journey from strangers to family. From desperation to abundance, a testament to what could grow when hardship met kindness and hunger met hope.